Hi, and welcome back to the Mob Mentality Show. I'm Chris Lucian, and my co-host is Austin Chadwick. And today we have a inflammatory topic maybe to talk about. I think Austin had come up with maybe a topic here. All infrastructure as code is immediately legacy code. So, what are you thinking here, and why are you making all of our listeners mad?
Yes, that's what you do on the internet. Just to get views, and it's not about quality content, Chris. No. So, again, this is coming from like everything for us, or almost everything for us, a just sharing perspective. Here's some things that have happened in my context and my experiences, and the results, whether it's good or bad. Your context may wildly vary, and your miles may vary. But here's something I've observed almost unilaterally with all infrastructure of code, is that it has all the attributes of legacy code as described by Feathers in his book. And before I get to the negative, the positive I want to say is I am a wholehearted champion of continuous delivery. I love pipelines. They're integrated in everything I've ever done in my context. So having something to be able to make a small code change and it go through the pipeline, and everything that needs to be checked and done before it's built and delivered is all done automatically and delivered to users, is absolutely wonderful for technical experimentation, market experimentation, all the things. Some of my favorite projects I've ever worked on have tons of infrastructure as code, and we can release dozens of times per day and run all kinds of experiments, and it's been some of the greatest joys. However, I feel like that the way the infrastructure of code is made is often brittle. So what I've seen is, what Feathers will talk about in the Working Effectively with Legacy Code book is that, again, this book goes back a while, but it's talking about regular code. So not infrastructure as code, but code, let's say, written in a desktop or a web app or anything else. And after the code is written, there's no way to know if it works in a fast fashion. So there's no unit tests. I think that was his famous definition of, is it legacy code? Are there unit tests or fast tests? And it's very brittle, and there's a lot of fear, right? So he talked about editing with confidence versus the edit and pray, where you change it and you just hope nothing breaks. It's hard to change. And instead of extending the code, people are scared of it, and then they just tend to rewrite whole cloth systems because it's so scary to touch it. So I've been working with infrastructure as code for quite some time now. I'd say about 7-8 years. And the large majority of infrastructure of code I've seen has all these characteristics. And the juice was still worth the squeeze, but it makes me wonder, should we be doing it differently? Is there a better way? I think the inflammatory version of it is everybody loves these frameworks where you write infrastructure as code as YAML, but the YAML inherently has all these problems. At least every version of that I've seen. Think of any popular infrastructure as code tool for any major cloud provider.
Yeah.
So I don't know. That was a bit of a monologue, Chris. What are your thoughts?
So,
Yeah.
yeah, so you're talking about things like CloudFormation or Terraform.
Yes. Yep.
Um, I guess you could extend that to like delivery pipeline YAML files and things like that. So,
Yes.
in YAML, yeah, so I guess a unit test would test some logic and then a cause and effect. So, what would it look like for you if it began to have some of those attributes? And can we do that with something that's in YAML at all?
Yeah. And I think YAML is a symptom of the problem, and it probably could be solved in YAML, because I feel like the way YAML came up, and again, I'm not a continuous delivery expert, but is people are like, let's do configuration for infrastructure as code, right?
Hmm.
And I think that makes sense because the YAML file feels more like a configuration, right, as opposed to programming. Um,
Right.
However, any system I've ever worked on satisfies the criteria of being bigger than a bread box. And the continuous delivery pipeline starts to become very complicated. And it starts to feel like not like configuration anymore. There's
Right.
lots of complexity going on in there. And so, for example, I've seen many bugs hit production because of mistakes made in the YAML infrastructure as code. Even with mobs and 4 pairs of eyes looking at the change as it's being made. And I've also seen lots of rewrites. I feel like it's very fashionable, the different tools for infrastructure as code. So what was top fashion 6 years ago is seen as like awful and terrible 2 years later. And I've seen mobs and teams completely rewrite their pipeline from scratch in a completely new tool and completely different YAML syntax. In about 6 years, I think I've seen it done 2 or 3 times for the same pipeline instead of extending it, right? And so huge amounts of cost. And again, worth it. It's the pipeline pays off, right? But wouldn't it be better to extend it as opposed to rewriting it from scratch every time? Wouldn't it be better to change it without fear and not cause bugs? And to get to your question, I think YAML isn't really the root of the problem. I just think every YAML infrastructure code framework I've seen, the only type of tests that come out of the box with the framework are end-to-end tests.
Right.
That run the YAML and then see if the infrastructure, for example, created in the cloud matches what you expect.
Mm-hmm.
If your infrastructure is bigger than a breadbox, that's a flaky end-to-end test. That's going to be slow, so you have slow feedback, and it's basically back to the slow GUI tests and all the problems you get with those. And so I've never seen a fast unit test framework for YAML, so to speak. However, pick any other main programming language, and there's wonderful unit test frameworks. Does that solve this problem? I don't know. Yeah.
Yeah, I think just kind of going through a mental exercise here. Um, I think you would need a potentially a fake or a mock of the cloud environment, for
Sure.
example. So, presumably if you had a fake that the YAML could run against or something, a fake system that the YAML could run against that spit out, it gives you an idea of what you have created without actually creating those things up in the cloud. Then you could do some approval style system, right? Um, I've been recently playing with AWS CDK, which is like a programmatic interface that creates cloud formation files. And that comes with a unit testing framework, but the unit tests just run a configuration comparison up against the cloud. So it does feel, I think those tests do take a significant amount of time, but you could mock that stuff if you wanted. But in the end, I think, a lot of those systems, the cloud systems change very often. They change out from under us, and locking those things down, in some way without support from the vendor may be impossible. So maybe the next level Amazon or Azure feature that people should be asking for is a unit testable fake cloud environment so that they can say were my resources created appropriately from this framework. I don't know. It could be an option
Sure.
because they're always updating their services, and how many AWS services are there out there right now? I think it's like a very, very high number, and all of them are changing independently from each other. So,
Yep.
um, it might be in the chaos area of the Cynefin framework, for example. I don't know.
Yeah. And so I've done some experimentation in this area, and I'll grant it's very limited. So most of this is pie in the sky, put on your tinfoil hat and imagine with me kind of scenario. But on some teams and mobs, instead of, hey, we need to update the CI/CD pipeline with handling this complicated delivery or test scenario, instead of editing the YAML, we start a new project. Pick your favorite scripting language. that's got good functionality, let's say Python or something like that, and let's bake it into there. And since it's a major programming language with unit testing and separation of concerns, you just follow all the same good practices that you use for web code or cloud code or anything else for business logic, but it's all there, right? And you can separate your concerns. So if you have concerns about vendor swapping, then you just have a wrapper for when you go to create something, right? And you're using the SDK as opposed to the built-in task in YAML. And it does feel archaic, but consider you have all the wonderful attributes that Feathers was talking about in solving legacy code for your CI/CD pipeline as well. And what we saw was the YAML we had left was felt more like configuration. To build the thing, run this script. So you lose some visibility in the cool CI/CD pipelines where it like visualizes the different stages and stuff.
Yeah.
But what we just found is that the logging of our script, we just made more and more robust. It just started visualizing more, and it started giving better error outputs when things went wrong. We even added AI messages. We gave it a personality. I think we made it Jerry Seinfeld because we felt like we were doing something related to the 80s in that product. So he would report the errors for us in the pipeline. But the YAML code stayed very simple and felt like configuration, and all the complexity was in the script. We had tests for the CI/CD, and we had separation of concerns. Granted, this was a very small project, but if you just imagine that for a larger project, would all the concerns go away? Would you no longer have fear with editing infrastructure as code? Would you no longer have brittleness? Would you no longer have bugs? If you wanted to rename something, you could just do it. You wouldn't know, like there are refactorings for YAML, but we're always like, is it the same? Does it have the same behavior before and after? We're always like, we're not sure. Let's run the whole pipeline, wait a half an hour, and then see if it is by manually checking. What if you could just run your unit test and say like, yep, we know it didn't change the behavior and it's much better now. So maybe a pie in the sky, but maybe experimentation there.
So is that tool that you're referring to writing the YAML and then the YAML gets run against the cloud? What's the end result?
No YAML. The YAML just calls a Python script, and the Python script does the work, whatever the work is needed for CI/CD or infrastructure as code.
Got it. Yeah. So very akin to using like Bodo 3 and Python to modify an AWS environment directly. Is that?
Sure. In this case, it wasn't AWS, but yes,
Yeah.
yeah, you would tie into a SDK like that, right? And then you can mock things so your feedback is fast as opposed to waiting for it to really get created.
Right. Yeah. So I think with a lot of these frameworks, they do talk about this idea of being able to roll forward, roll back, and then that's why you create a stack up in the cloud. So I do think you'd probably lose a little bit of that in that scenario by not using those built-in tools. But the flip side of that is that as long as you knew how to decommission the resources that were already created, then rolling back should be an okay thing to do. So I don't know. That's a good question. It might be a good question to throw back out to our audience. Austin, you have any more on this topic or? Yeah.
No, go ahead and close her down. Yeah, I'd love to hear what people think because I feel like this is an area where I might be on the edge of a cliff and someone's like, no, Austin, you're crazy. You haven't tried X, Y, and Z, and then you'll love YAML, you'll love all these tools, and you don't have all these legacy code problems. I would love for someone to correct me, so that'd be great.
Yeah. Well, so in my imagination, I think maybe the AWS CDK stuff where it's just Python writing CloudFormation and CloudFormation runs. You could still test all the Python code that you were doing there by patching it with unit tests or something. But that would be like a very specific example. But you still don't get the confirmation that anything worked properly in the first place for maybe a small subset of what you're testing. So, but with that, we will ask everybody, If you know somebody who knows a lot in this area, share this episode with them so that they can post in the comments. Maybe they'll subscribe too. And then, yeah, thanks, Austin, for bringing this great topic to the table here. And, mob on, everyone. And we'll talk to you all next time. Have a good one.
See ya.